Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight in your chest. That heaviness you carry, it's not just yours, is it? It's your mother's anxiety, your father's anger, your grandmother's fear of never being enough. These invisible chains that bind you, they weren't forged in your lifetime. They were passed down, link by link, generation after generation, until they became so familiar you thought they were part of your DNA. But today, right here, right now, we're going to talk about breaking those chains. We're going to confront something that's been haunting not just you, but your entire family line. Something so powerful it can shape destinies, yet so subtle, most people live their entire lives never recognizing its presence. Let me ask you something. Have you ever caught yourself saying words that aren't yours? Found yourself reacting to situations exactly like your parent did? Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen the same fear in your eyes that you saw in your mother's? That's not coincidence. That's not just learned behavior. That's generational trauma speaking through you. Imagine for a moment you're standing in front of a vast mirror maze. Each reflection shows a different generation of your family. Look closely. See how that anger you struggle with matches your father's stance. Notice how your relationship patterns mirror your mother's choices. Observe how your fear of success echoes your grandfather's unfulfilled dreams. These aren't random similarities. They're echoes of unhealed wounds reverberating through time. You see, generational trauma isn't just about the big, obvious traumas, the wars, the migrations, the visible hardships. It's in the subtle things too. It's in the way you apologize for taking up space, just like your grandmother did. It's in how you push away love, believing you don't deserve it, just like your father did. It's in the constant drive to prove yourself, running from the ghost of your mother's disapproval. Today, I'm not just talking about understanding this trauma, I'm talking about breaking it. Because here's the truth that most people don't want to face. Every single one of us is either perpetuating these patterns or breaking them. There is no neutral ground. Every time you react without awareness, every time you choose silence over truth, every time you accept less than you deserve, you're strengthening those chains that bind not just you, but the generations to come. But what if I told you that you have the power to end cycles that have persisted for generations? What if I told you that right here, right now, you could begin to rewrite not just your story, but the story of your entire family line? Would you believe me? More importantly, would you be ready to do the work? Because breaking generational trauma isn't just about healing yourself. It's about healing your past and protecting your future. It's about standing at a crucial point in your family's timeline and saying, this pattern stops with me. It's about having the courage to look at those wounds that have been passed down like unwanted inheritances and deciding they won't be passed on any further. You might be thinking, but I'm just one person. How can I possibly change patterns that have existed for generations? Let me tell you something. Every major transformation in history started with one person deciding enough was enough. Every chain was broken by someone who dared to question why it existed in the first place. Let me break down for you what this weight really means, because understanding it is the first step to releasing it. When I talk about generational trauma, I'm not just talking about stories passed down in family albums. I'm talking about the invisible programming that runs in the background of your life, like software you never chose to install. Think about it. How many times have you caught yourself saying, I'll never be like my parents, only to find yourself repeating their exact patterns? How many times have you sworn to do things differently, only to fall back into familiar cycles? That's because generational trauma isn't just in your mind. It's in your body, your nervous system, your very cells. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a beautiful garden. Now imagine that garden has been watered with toxic water for generations. The soil itself becomes contaminated. Each new flower that grows absorbs that toxicity, not because it chooses to, but because that's all it knows. That's what generational trauma does to families. The pain, the fear, the limiting beliefs, they become the water that nourishes each new generation. But here's what makes this weight so devastating. It feels normal. When you've carried a heavy backpack your entire life, you don't realize how heavy it is until you take it off. When everyone in your family carries the same weight, you don't question it. You think it's just how life is supposed to feel. Let me give you some examples. Maybe you grew up in a family where love was conditional, where affection was tied to achievement. Now, as an adult, you find yourself constantly striving, never feeling good enough, always needing to prove your worth. That's not your pattern. That's inherited unworthiness. Or perhaps you come from a line of strong women who never allowed themselves to be vulnerable, who wore their independence like armor. And now you find yourself pushing away every person who tries to get close, sabotaging relationships before they can sabotage you. That's not your fear. That's your grandmother's trauma speaking through you. The cost of carrying these wounds is astronomical. It affects every aspect of your life, your relationships, your career, your health, your dreams. It's like trying to run a race with weights strapped to your ankles. You can do it, but you'll never reach your full potential until you learn to remove those weights. And here's the most painful part. This weight doesn't just affect you. Every time you react from your inherited trauma, every time you let those old patterns drive your behavior, you're teaching the next generation that this is normal. Your children don't just inherit your eye color and your smile, they inherit your fears, your limitations, your unhealed wounds. But I want you to understand something crucial. Recognizing this weight isn't about blame. It's not about pointing fingers at your parents or grandparents. They too were carrying their own inherited burdens. They too were doing the best they could with the awareness they had. The question isn't who's to blame for this weight. The question is, who's going to be brave enough to finally put it down? Who's going to be the one to say, this stops with me? Because that's what healing generational trauma requires. Courage. The courage to look at these patterns honestly, to feel this weight fully, and to choose consciously and deliberately to set it down. Let me dive into the cycle of transmission, how these patterns perpetuate themselves across generations. You know what fascinates me about trauma? It's like a master musician playing the same song across generations, but most of us never recognize the tune. We just dance to it unconsciously, generation after generation, wondering why we keep ending up in the same place. And let me show you how this cycle works. Imagine a child growing up in a home where emotions were never discussed, where feelings were treated as weaknesses. What does that child learn? They learn to suppress their emotions, to wear a mask of strength, to push down their true feelings until they can't even recognize them anymore. Now, fast forward 20 years. That child becomes a parent. When their own child comes to them crying, what's their instinctive response? Stop crying, be strong, don't show weakness. And just like that, the cycle continues. Not because they want to hurt their child, but because that's the only language of emotion they know. That's the cycle of transmission. But it goes deeper than just obvious behaviors. These patterns get encoded in our very being. Scientists now understand that trauma actually alters our DNA, changing how our genes express themselves. Think about that for a moment. Your grandmother's experience of famine, your father's experience of war, your mother's experience of displacement. They're not just stories. They're biological imprints carried in your cells. Let me break it down for you. When your grandfather learned that the world wasn't safe, his body produced stress hormones. Those hormones changed how his genes worked. Those changed genes, they got passed down to your parent and then to you. You inherited not just his eye color, but his anxiety, his hypervigilance, his deep-seated belief that the world isn't safe. And here's where it gets really interesting. These survival mechanisms, these adaptations that helped your ancestors survive their challenges, they're still running in your system. But here's the crucial question. Are they still serving you, or are they holding you back? Think about it. Your grandmother's habit of hoarding food might have helped her survive real scarcity. But your inability to feel financially secure, even when your bank account is full, that's her trauma talking through your nervous system. Your father's emotional distance might have helped him cope with loss. But your difficulty with intimate relationships, that's his unprocessed pain speaking through your relationships. The most insidious part about this cycle is how invisible it seems when you're in it. It's like being born into a room where everyone walks with a limp. You wouldn't question the limp. You'd think that's just how walking is supposed to be. That's what makes breaking these cycles so challenging. These patterns feel like your identity. They feel like who you are. But they're not who you are. They're who you learn to be. They're adaptations to circumstances that no longer exist. They're survival mechanisms for battles that ended generations ago. The price of living in this unconscious cycle is devastating. Every time you react from these old patterns, every time you let these inherited fears drive your decisions, you're not just reinforcing them in yourself, you're teaching them to everyone around you. Your children don't just learn from what you tell them, they learn from how you live, how you love, how you handle fear and pain and joy. Let me take you into the awakening moment, that pivotal point when everything changes. You know what the most powerful moment in human consciousness is? It's that split second when you suddenly see a pattern that's been invisible your entire life. It's like someone turning on a light in a dark room you've been living in for years. Suddenly you can see everything that was there all along. Let me tell you what this moment looks like. It's that instant when you're yelling at your child and you suddenly hear your mother's voice coming out of your mouth, word for word. It's that moment when you're sabotaging another relationship and you finally recognize it's the same way your father pushed love away. It's that second when you're looking at your own child's fear of failure and you realize you gave them that gift, the same gift your parents gave you. This awakening, it's not gentle, it's not comfortable. It's like being doused with ice-cold water, because once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Once you recognize these cycles, you can't pretend they don't exist anymore. And that's when you face the most crucial decision of your life. Will you continue the cycle, or will you be the one to break it? Here's what makes this moment so powerful. It's the first time you realize you have a choice. Up until now, you've been running on autopilot, playing out scripts written generations before you were born. But in this moment of awareness, you suddenly understand that you can write a new script. You can choose a different response. You can create a new pattern. But let me be clear about something. This awareness comes with responsibility. Once you see how these patterns work, once you understand how they're passed down, you become responsible for what you do with that knowledge. You can no longer hide behind the excuse of, that's just how I am, or that's how we've always done things. Think about it like this. If you discovered your house was built on a fault line that could damage every house around it, would you ignore that information? Would you keep building on that same unstable ground? Or would you take responsibility for creating a stronger foundation? That's what this awakening moment is about. Recognizing that you're standing at a crucial point in your family's timeline. You're the one who can see the patterns. You're the one who understands their impact, and that means you're the one who can choose to change them. But here's what most people don't tell you about this awakening. It's not a one-time event. It's a series of moments, each one peeling back another layer of understanding. Each time you catch yourself in an old pattern, each time you recognize an inherited fear driving your decisions, each time you see your family's pain playing out in your own life, that's another awakening moment. Another chance to choose differently? The real question isn't whether you'll have these awakening moments, you will. The question is, what will you do with them? Will you push the awareness away because it's too painful? Will you acknowledge it, but continue in the same patterns because change feels too hard? Or will you use these moments as catalysts for transformation? Let me walk you into the healing journey, because awareness without action is just another form of self-torture. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is crucial. Healing generational trauma isn't about taking a weekend workshop or reading a self-help book. It's not about having one big breakthrough moment and suddenly everything's fixed. It's about consistent conscious choice making, day after day, moment after moment. Think about it like this. If you've been walking with a limp your entire life, simply realizing you're limping isn't enough to change your gait. You need to retrain your muscles. You need to create new neural pathways. You need to teach your body a new way of moving through the world. That's what healing generational trauma is like. Let me give you the tools you need for this journey. First, you need to understand that healing happens in layers. Just when you think you've dealt with a pattern, life will present you with a deeper version of the same lesson. Don't get discouraged. This isn't failure. This is the healing process revealing itself to you. The first step is learning to catch yourself in the act. When you feel that familiar trigger, when you notice yourself falling into old patterns, that's your moment of power. That's your opportunity to pause, to breathe, to choose differently. It might only be a split second, but that split second is where all the power lies. Here's what most people don't understand about transformation. It's not about forcing yourself to be different. It's about creating enough space between trigger and response that you can make a conscious choice. It's about interrupting those automatic reactions that have been running on autopilot for generations. Let me tell you something powerful. Every time you choose a different response, you're not just changing your behavior, you're literally rewiring your brain, you're creating new neural pathways, you're teaching your nervous system that there are other ways to respond to life's challenges. But here's the crucial part. You can't do this alone. Our wounds were created in relationship, and they must be healed in relationship. Find people who can hold space for your healing, find teachers who can guide you, find communities that understand this journey. Because when you're breaking patterns that have existed for generations, you need witnesses to your transformation. And let me be clear about something. This journey will demand everything from you. It will require you to face parts of yourself you've been running from. It will ask you to feel emotions that have been buried for generations. It will challenge every belief you've ever held about who you are and what you're capable of. But here's what makes it all worth it. Every step you take on this healing journey doesn't just change you. It changes the entire trajectory of your family line. Every pattern you break, every wound you heal, every new choice you make becomes a gift to every generation that follows you. Think about that. Your healing becomes your children's foundation. Your courage becomes their starting point. Your consciousness becomes their inheritance. Instead of passing down trauma, you're passing down transformation. Let me guide you through rewiring the family system, because true healing requires us to transform not just ourselves, but our entire family dynamic. Now, let me tell you something profound about family systems. They're like intricate dances where everyone knows their steps by heart. When one person starts dancing differently, it changes the entire choreography. That's what happens when you begin to heal generational trauma. You're essentially changing the steps of a dance that's been performed for generations. Think about your family system right now. Every role, every reaction, every relationship dynamic, it's all been carefully orchestrated to maintain what we call homeostasis. Even if that balance is unhealthy, even if it's causing pain, the system will fight to maintain it, because that's what systems do. They resist change. But here's what makes rewiring these systems so powerful. When you change your part in the dance, everyone else has to adjust. When you stop playing your assigned role, when you start setting healthy boundaries, when you begin communicating differently, you create a ripple effect that forces the entire system to evolve. Let me break this down into practical terms. When you come from a family where emotions were never discussed and you start speaking openly about your feelings, you're not just changing yourself. You're introducing a new possibility into the family system. You're showing that there's another way to exist, another way to relate, another way to connect. But I want to be honest with you. This part of the journey is often the most challenging, because when you start changing the family dynamics, you'll face resistance. People who are comfortable with the old patterns will try to pull you back into your familiar role. They might say things like, "You've changed," or "You think you're better than us now," or "You're causing problems in the family." And here's what you need to understand. This resistance isn't personal. It's not about you. It's about the system trying to maintain its balance. When you stop playing your part in dysfunctional patterns, you're essentially holding up a mirror to everyone else's roles in those patterns. And not everyone is ready to look in that mirror. But let me tell you something crucial. You don't need everyone's permission to create change. You don't need your entire family to understand or support your healing journey. You just need to stay committed to your own transformation. Because here's the truth. As you change, you create a new possibility in the family system. You become living proof that another way is possible. Think about what this means for future generations. When you refuse to perpetuate toxic patterns, when you create new ways of relating, when you build healthy boundaries, You're not just changing your life, you're creating a new blueprint for your children, your nieces, your nephews, everyone who comes after you. Remember this, every healthy boundary you set, every difficult conversation you initiate, every new pattern you create becomes a gift to your entire family line. You're not just healing yourself, you're healing your family's future. Let me show you what it means to become the pattern breaker, because this is where your personal transformation becomes a powerful force for change. You see, being a pattern breaker isn't just about recognizing old cycles and choosing different responses. It's about having the courage to stand alone when necessary, to walk a path that no one in your family has walked before. It's about becoming the person you needed when you were younger. Let me tell you something powerful. When you choose to break generational patterns, you're not just making a personal choice. You're making a revolutionary decision that will echo through time. You're saying to generations of accumulated pain, this stops here, this stops with me. Think about what this really means. Every time you choose conscious response over reactive behavior, every time you choose self-respect over people-pleasing, every time you choose healthy boundaries over familiar dysfunction, you're not just changing your story, you're changing your family's entire narrative. But here's what most people don't tell you about being a pattern breaker. It can be a deeply lonely journey. When you're the first person in your family to go to therapy, to speak up about abuse, to set boundaries, to choose different relationships, to parent differently, you're walking a path with no familial footprints to follow. Sometimes you'll feel like a stranger in your own family. You'll speak a language of healing that they don't understand. You'll see patterns that they're not ready to acknowledge. You'll create boundaries that they're not prepared to respect. And in those moments, you need to remember something crucial. Your discomfort with growth is still better than your comfort with dysfunction. Being a pattern breaker means becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable. It means learning to stand in your truth, even when your entire family system is trying to pull you back into old roles. It means being willing to be the difficult one, the sensitive one, the dramatic one, because those labels often come when you're the first to say, this isn't okay anymore. But here's what makes it all worth it. Every step you take in breaking these patterns creates a bridge for others to follow. Your courage becomes permission for others to change. Your healing becomes a lighthouse for those still lost in the fog of generational trauma. Think about it. Every time you choose differently, you're not just changing your life. You're showing others what's possible. You're creating new traditions of healing, of conscious living, of emotional intelligence. You're building a new legacy that will influence generations to come. Let me reveal to you the ripple effect, because your healing journey creates waves that touch shores you may never see. You know, when you drop a stone into still water, those ripples don't just move forward. They expand in every direction, touching everything in their path. That's exactly what happens when you commit to healing generational trauma. Your transformation doesn't just move forward to future generations. It ripples outward, touching everyone around you. Now, let me paint this picture for you. When you choose to heal, when you break those generational patterns, you're not just changing your immediate family system, you're influencing your friends, your colleagues, your community. Every person who witnesses your transformation gets a glimpse of what's possible in their own life. Think about this. Every time you model healthy boundaries, every time you demonstrate emotional intelligence, every time you choose conscious response over reactive behavior, you're teaching without saying a word. You're showing others that there's another way to exist, another way to relate, another way to live. But here's what makes this ripple effect so powerful. It's exponential. When you heal yourself, you create space for others to heal. When you break free from generational patterns, you give others permission to examine their own inherited trauma. Your courage becomes contagious. Your transformation becomes inspiration. Imagine this. Your healing influences your children who carry these new patterns into their schools, their friendships, their future relationships. Those children influence their peers who take these lessons back to their own families. Those families influence their communities. And suddenly, your individual choice to heal has created waves of transformation across entire communities. Let me tell you something profound. When you choose to heal generational trauma, you're not just changing your family's future. You're contributing to the healing of collective consciousness. You're adding your drop of healing to the ocean of human experience. You're helping to create a world where conscious living becomes the norm, not the exception. But here's what most people don't realize about this ripple effect. It works both ways. Just as your healing influences others, their transformation reinforces your own. Every person who witnesses your journey and chooses to heal becomes part of a growing network of conscious individuals. You become part of a movement larger than yourself. Think about the legacy you're creating. Generations from now, your descendants won't just inherit your physical characteristics. They'll inherit your courage, your consciousness, your commitment to healing. Your decision to break generational patterns today becomes their foundation for tomorrow. Right here, right now, I want you to feel the weight of this moment. Feel the convergence of past and future running through your veins. Feel the presence of every ancestor who carried these wounds and every descendant waiting to be born into either healing or hurt. This moment, your moment, is the fulcrum point between what was and what could be. Let me be crystal clear about something. You're not here by accident. The fact that you're listening to these words, that you're beginning to understand these patterns, that you're feeling this stirring in your soul, that's not coincidence. That's consciousness calling you to rise. That's generations of unhealed trauma reaching critical mass, demanding transformation through you. Today, I'm not just asking you to understand generational trauma. I'm not just asking you to recognize patterns. I'm calling you to action. I'm challenging you to make a decision that will echo through time. Will you continue to be a carrier of unhealed wounds, or will you become a bearer of transformation? Now think about this. Every single person who ever changed the course of history started with a single decision. Every movement, every transformation, every revolution began with one person saying, "Enough, this stops with me." That's the decision in front of you right now. I want you to make a commitment to yourself right here, right now. Commit to becoming aware of these patterns. Commit to catching yourself in those reactive moments. Commit to choosing differently, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's scary, even when you're standing alone. This isn't about perfection. This isn't about never making mistakes. This is about conscious choice making. This is about having the courage to say, I see these patterns and I choose differently. This is about being willing to do the hard work of transformation, not just for yourself, but for every life your life will touch. Remember what we talked about. Your healing isn't just about you. Your transformation becomes medicine for your entire family line. Your courage becomes a bridge for others to cross. Your consciousness becomes a light in the darkness of unconscious living. So what will you do with this knowledge? What will you do with this understanding? Will you let it be just another interesting conversation, or will you let it be the catalyst for real change? The choice is yours, but the impact of that choice will echo through generations. I challenge you to start today. Start right now. The next time you feel that familiar trigger, pause. The next time you catch yourself in an old pattern, breathe. The next time you feel the weight of generational trauma pressing down, stand tall. Choose differently. Choose consciously. Choose healing. Because here's the truth. The time for unconscious living is over. The time for carrying ancient wounds is done. The time for transformation is now. And you, yes, you are the one who can make that transformation real.